right, so the book that I chose to do my critical book analysis on is The Selling of the President in 1968 by Joe McGinnis. Just a few reasons I chose this book. Number one, the title sounded really cool to me because I didn't understand the concept, and as I've noted in class before, since I don't really know much about politics going into the class, I figured the one with the easiest title might be the easiest for me to read and not have as much jargon. But we'll get a little more into that later. So starting off, I felt that before I could really tell you my thoughts on the book and kind of what I learned from the book, we kind of need some background about what's going on at this time, who the author is, and that sort of stuff. So the author is Joe McGinnis. He wrote the book. This is the actual cover of the book, what the front of it looks like. As you can see, Nixon is on a carton of cigarettes, just to simplify and symbolize how easily accessible it is to actually buy the president, and the term selling of the president, which we'll get into a little bit later. So the book was written during the 1968 Richard Nixon campaign. This was right after his loss in the previous campaign. The perspective is from the author. He actually went behind the scenes to show what an actual campaign looks like, what you don't see on the surface, what's behind the curtain. And so he became a member of Nixon's campaign team, wrote this sort of expose type book, and then released it in 1968 during that time. But whenever it hit the market, it became a bestseller. It was the first of its kind. No one had seen anything like it. And it was just flying off the shelves, and people had never gotten that concept before of kind of like that expose type writing from a writer. So let's talk about the title of the book. So the title is The Selling of the President. And in my head, I was like, okay, so we're selling the president. Is the president for sale? Is this like black market talk? What's going on? Is this just, political jargon that I don't really understand? Obviously, it's going to be explained to me in the book. So going into it, these are kind of the mindsets I had, even though I knew that this was nonfiction and obviously no one is literally buying the president. I just, wanted to have that kind of mindset going into it so that it would be easier for me to understand. And so I quickly learned that the selling of the president, that term is not necessarily the legitimate act of buying something. It's the term of selling the idea of a president. And in the book, I learned that there's just this really fine line between what you cast your ballot for. When you cast your ballot in an election, are you voting for the possibility of what this candidate can bring to the table, or are you voting on the success of the campaign? And so that's just one thing that really stood out to me in this book. And so the big theme that I saw throughout this book was, it's not what's there that counts, it's what's projected. And just to put that in layman terms, that's appearances can be deceiving. So necessarily what's going on here is throughout this book, we're seeing how Richard's campaign team saw that he was not an appealing opponent. He was not an appealing candidate to the voters, and they needed to be able to just kind of soften those round edges. And so what they did is they took this idea that people had of him, and they were like, how can we market it to fit what those people want? And so they changed his appearance, tried to make him seem more like a likable man, and just tried to get the voters to buy into what they were selling. And so their whole purpose throughout the campaign was just try to make that picture-perfect image of Nixon that voters were able to see. And so throughout the book, this theme is really, really shown. And you can just see the different ways how they're making sure that what you're buying is not necessarily what's being sold. So whenever we do cast our vote for a ballot, it's kind of like handing over that check. In my paper, I reference this theme as, think about it as this very long episode of QVC that you're watching. They have all these different things for sale. They're showing you why you need them, how it can change your life, how it can impact it, why you need to call today. And the next thing you know, you're on the phone giving them your credit card information. And the same thing is, you can see that same thing in a presidential campaign. And so when all these advisors and all of the campaign teams and all this, and they're putting out this one image of a president that we see and this possible presidential candidate, like we're seeing them, what are they going to offer us? What do we need? Why do we need them? And so us casting our ballot is us handing over that credit card information. And so just throughout that book, we see how appearances can be a little deceiving, and we need, as Americans, need to wake up and realize what we're actually doing when we cast our ballot. So just some few notes. I know there's not much on the screen, but just gives us a little more to talk about. Some important notes that I found in the book, and I thought that were just kind of interesting for me and helped me get through it and, read it without putting it down and giving up, is the book is written as an expose, and for me that was pretty cool just to see that perspective of the political campaign, what's going on behind those closed doors, what are Americans not getting to see, and just knowing that this piece that he wrote, as soon as it came out, people realized what was going on. There weren't many, writers that were able to go behind those closed doors in the campaign with all that free access. So as the first of its kind, and quite possibly, the only one of that caliber of this type of writing, that was pretty interesting for me. It just kind of set that scene. I know that it was a nonfiction book, but that knowledge in the back of my head that it was an expose just kind of gave it that little element of surprise, undercoverness, and just helped me really get through the book. So the term picture perfect image. So like I said, this is what Nixon's campaign team was trying to create for him. They knew that the audience, they didn't really like what they were seeing. They weren't really buying into Nixon, obviously because of his past loss in the campaign previous to this campaign. Try that. Didn't really make a lot of sense. But his team essentially was just looking at what can we do to make sure that the people know what they're getting and they're getting something that they want. So it's kind of like they're giving us what we want to see, not necessarily what's actually there. And then television as a platform. Nixon's campaign was one of the first political campaigns to take this medium of television and use it to better his campaign. So he started going on this little show that they made specifically for him to boost his audience. And I thought it was really cool in the book. They talk about how they create these commercials for Nixon's campaign, and they do it to the point where everything that he wants to get through, all of his messages and media, can be done without him actually having to be there or being the voice in the commercial. So because they knew that Richard Nixon wasn't really that super lovable, fun guy that they were trying to show everyone else, they were still able to capture that in his commercials. And so they weren't really portraying necessarily the words that he wanted to. They were trying to show that he could be emotionally available, and that's what they were trying to broadcast to the voters. One of the really cool quotes that I found in this book was, "Politics is a con game, and so is advertising." That's not verbatim, but essentially the book shows us how we can take politics and we can take a salesman and we can put them together, and there's a really, really fine line. There's a lot of things that are similar while there are a few differences. Politics was also referenced to like the showbiz. So there are so many areas where politics is simply putting on a face, putting on an image for consumers, and that's what we are as voters. So I just thought this statement throughout the book was actually pretty cool. And then here's some things that I noted, some comparisons between Trump's 2020 election and Nixon's 68 election campaign. And so one of the quotes that I saw, I did some research, was that it's possible to get people to see you in a different light as a strong leader, but also as a human. So that's essentially what Nixon was trying to do. He was trying to show the campaign, trying to show the voters that he was more than just the leader he was portraying himself to be. He could also show you his human side. And so I think also we can see that in Trump's election and in his campaign right now is, look at all the stuff that he's had to deal with as the president, and seeing that he can be that leader, he can be the strong business type, but also with sympathy and empathizing, he can show us that he's also human. And so I thought that comparison was pretty cool. And then I'm a very visual person, so I just thought the fact that they both have pictures from their campaign with their arms out just kind of helped solidify this comparison. Also, in my research, I found that Edward Cox, which is actually Nixon's son-in-law, he went to Nixon's inaugural speech, which if you do some research, you'll see that Trump is actually reflecting his campaign for 2020 off of a lot of Nixon's points from his 1968 campaign. And when Trump gave this last speech, Nixon's son-in-law was actually in attendance, and he heard the speech. And the quote that he gave afterwards was talking about how even though history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, it's certainly rhyming, and we can see a softer, simpler rhyme here made by Trump of what Nixon's campaign was. And so also I talked about how Nixon was the first one to use television in his campaigns. We can kind of see how Trump does the same thing with social media. And we talked about this later in one of our few chapters a while back of how Trump just kind of used social media to gain followers and gain voters. And I think that the same thing can be said with Nixon in that likeness, that they both used a different form of media to reach the people that they thought they wouldn't be able to reach. And so just a few final notes just to sum this up for y'all. Sorry, I know I talk a lot, but here are my thoughts. If I was to rate the book on a scale of 1 to 10, I would give it an 8. Like I said, I don't really understand a lot of politics. This class has helped me learn more, and I can say that I'm a lot more comfortable now than I was just talking about politics in general, putting my opinion out there. But I actually really enjoyed the book. I surprised myself. I didn't know that I was going to like it, but in the end I did. The only reason I only gave it an 8 is because it was a little hard to read, because it's not what I'm used to reading, but I thought it was good. I really enjoyed the perspective from the narrator that, you know, he was behind the scenes. This is his first testimonial story of what actually happens in a campaign, and I just thought that was really cool. And I got to learn more about Nixon's candidacy. I really didn't know much other than obviously Watergate from Nixon. So just being able to look at, you know, an inside look at the people that were actually there, that were making things happen, was pretty cool to me. And so yeah, I really enjoyed the book. This is a quote from the book that says, "When style and charisma connotes the idea of contriving of public relations, I don't buy it at all." And I really just like the end of the sentence because it says, "I don't buy it at all," especially since the whole idea, the whole mission of the book is talking about how Nixon's campaign is essentially just trying to sell you on the idea of Richard Nixon. And so that is my presentation for my critical book analysis. I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed making it and getting to present it. Thanks.